Hello, I'm David Johnson, Principal Program Manager within Microsoft's IT organization. I'm responsible and accountable for our Microsoft 365 tenancy from the architecture, governance, and how we help our businesses be successful in our tenancy. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is how we manage Microsoft 365 groups. And this becomes such a foundational, important conversation, especially now that our employees are working in multiple locations. Groups become a foundation to so many things. How employees work in Microsoft Teams, how employees share information in SharePoint, how employees work with Yammer and communities. This is the foundation for a lot of those things. And how do I do it at scale? How do I manage a company of the impact of what Microsoft has with a lot of conversations, a lot of guests, with the notion of making sure my employees are successful while I protect the company? And so I'll talk a lot about how I do that, a little bit about my governance principles, how I manage groups, and we'll talk through the overall lessons learned of this as we do this. So what I'm going to talk about today is how Microsoft thinks about our own collaboration governance. How do we govern ourselves? How do we empower our employees? I mentioned the criticality of that, and it's something that we're going to talk a lot about. But at the same time, if I'm going to manage and empower my employees to be successful, how do I protect the company? And the nice thing about this is Microsoft Groups provides me foundation as I talk about this. Lastly, how do I tie the things in product, which I will talk about how we configure groups, with where IT does our own stuff to make sure we can manage the tenancy at the scale we have for a large organization. So a little bit about that. We are a giant company, effectively. We have a lot of content in SharePoint OneDrive, for example, backing Teams, almost 9 petabytes of just files, forgetting anything else. And we have a lot of employees, roughly 240,000 accounts, another more than 500,000 guests. And that is predominantly because we want our employees to be successful in collaboration in place. We want to make it so that employees can share and partner in teams with each other inside the company and outside the company where it makes sense. And Microsoft 365 groups provide that plumbing as I go forward with that. And I'll talk about, therefore, how I manage groups, because as you can see from the slide, I have a lot of them, 350,000 groups that I have to manage. And that obviously is huge. And since every group has a SharePoint, therefore I've got that number of SharePoints. Plus, I still have a lot of other types of SharePoints that exist on top of that, which is why there's so many things that I have to manage. But fundamentally, the reason that from an IT perspective we get this big is I am enabling what we consider our seamless teamwork for our employees. That employees should be able to collaborate internally as it within teams, get their work done with each other, and I should be able to enable leaders to engage with employees, whether it's live broadcast or stream videos or portal for knowledge management. Those are all things that I'm enabling, and all things in many cases powered by the Microsoft 365 group. So when I talk about governing and managing the group and for myself, that's why I'm doing it. And this is scale that I'm talking about, obviously high scale. So like many other IT organizations, I have some concerns going in. As soon as you light up Microsoft Teams, for example, and you want self-service, well, on the one hand, self-service is great because your employees, they work there. It's where teamwork happens. It's brilliant. Every employee wants to just IT, get out of my way. But at the same time, as IT, I worry about chaos. I worry about sprawl. I worry about how do I make sure I'm protecting my stuff and being compliant from a legal perspective. I want to make sure that we're not overexposing things that shouldn't be overexposed. But at the same time, I don't want employees bypassing IT. Obviously, especially now if employees are remote, there's a tendency and a potential risk to using services that IT doesn't sanction to get the job done. And maybe that's okay in some cases, but from an IT perspective, I want people on my services. I want people using Microsoft 365 on where I manage it. That way I can bring the company together, I can govern, I can protect, I can be compliant. And I get a lot of conversations and questions from customers about this, about how do I do it? And I won't read them all off because there's a lot of questions that I talk to, but fundamentally this is how do I enable my employees and where do I let people do things with Teams, for example? How do I manage that sprawl that I mentioned? All things that I have to deal with, and I'll talk a lot about these individual things. So just backing up again, I think about Microsoft 365 groups as the kind of enabler for a lot of this, that the group becomes the construct, the membership construct that provides the foundation for the membership for that modern SharePoint site, for that modern Yammer group, for that team, Microsoft Teams. Every team is Microsoft 365 group backed. And one of the really cool things that's happened more recently is now Yammer's fully come on the platform as well, not just being group connected, but being native for groups, meaning that data from a Yammer community is really stored in SharePoint, for example, that the membership from a Yammer group is really Microsoft 365 groups. The guests that are in a Yammer group are now Microsoft 365 guests, just like any other group type. And that's the beauty of it. And so one of the reasons why I manage at the Microsoft 365 group level is because I want to manage all the independent workloads. And I don't even mention all the other ones like Stream and Planner and all the other workloads that have this group dependency. But that's the beauty of it. If I manage groups centrally, I'm also managing the foundation for many of the workloads my employees are using to get their job done. And I have a controls and empowerment for my compliance work that I've got to go do. So I can drive this from a centralized level, no matter whether my employee is creating a group in Outlook and they just want to replace a distribution list, which, by the way, we really encourage. We want people to get away from DLs, but also whether you're in a Yammer community or you're in a Microsoft team. And SharePoint is everywhere, so therefore, of course, clearly that's going to be a big part of all this too. So, like any other IT organization, I have a lot of different almost people that I've got to make sure I'm making happy. I mentioned the employment, that the employees themselves, that employees are going to work around IT if I'm not doing my job right effectively. And I want to make it the easiest possible path for that employee to be the right path, to be the IT sanctioned path. And by the way, that path should be the compliant path, so legal is going to be happy. It's going to be the security path, so the security is going to be happy. So I want to use that 365 group as the place my employees are getting their job done, fundamentally. But I've got Xbox who tells me, well, I want to do collaboration with gaming studios, but I also have really sensitive information. I need to protect it. Same thing's true of Surface. LinkedIn will tell me, okay, I've got these LinkedIn teams and groups, but I want to make sure that if a group has customer data, I have these really strong retention policies in place. I have these really strong rules around what must be in that LinkedIn Microsoft 365 group. So I've got business and employee and security that I'm all trying to basically balance and manage the needs for, while at the same time, of course, being legally compliant, making sure that I can handle things like e-discovery and retention and document management that makes legal happy. And of course, as IT, we're an organization that's not sized to manage the entire Microsoft by just not having the tooling and manageability on this stuff. So I've got to think through what are the implications for an IT admin to manage this services set at scale. So Microsoft 365 Groups provides me that management enablement plumbing for managing all these things. But this is the governance body that I have to think through effectively in who I work with. And internally, we've come a long way. That I mentioned the chaos earlier and the risk to a company, but already I have self-service enablement, so my employees can create things. I've got controls around that. I've got ownership controls, so the right things are in place. I manage oversharing. I'm not perfect about that, but I manage oversharing, and I keep collaboration happening on the tenant largely. And so the nice thing about this is, and I'll talk a little bit more about these things, but I feel I'm in a much better state from an IT manageability standpoint on groups. Now, let me talk about how I did that and what I'm doing. First, I start this off by talking about my principles of governance for containers, because in my case, what I call a Microsoft 365 group, and I'll just use groups for this point on, a group is effectively that container, whether that's a SharePoint site or of a team or a Yammer group community, I don't care. It's a container, it's a group. I want my employees to get that group when they need it. So number one, I'm going to empower my employees to go create that group. Great. But by the way, I'm not going to let anyone create a group. If you're an intern or supplier, contractor, you're not going to be able to create a group, because if I need to make sure that I'm empowering my employees, I'm also holding my employees accountable, meaning they need to be aware of what the rule book is. They need to be aware from a training perspective of what their employment contract effectively says. Annually, we make employees go through standards of business conduct, which means employees must basically reattest and say, yes, I understand how to handle this type of data, sensitive information, and protect the company. Great. We're going to make sure, therefore, we empower those employees to get the things they need. So I'm going to enable self-service creation. I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But Just because I let you get something doesn't mean I'm going to keep it forever. I'm going to take it away when it's either not active, not needed, or when the employee simply isn't accountable for it anymore. So I'm going to make sure that thing only exists as long as it's needed. That team, that SharePoint, that group is only there as long as it has to be. But here's the catch. I mentioned earlier that I've got 350,000 of these things. Well, they're not all equal. Some of them have pre-earnings information in them. Some of them have customer data, highly confidential information. Some of them have attended Xbox projects or device projects going on. So clearly I need to identify, of all these groups that I have, where is it the sensitive stuff? The company needs to provide the most protection in these areas and groups. And so I think about that. But I trust but verify. I will let my employees tell me what the stuff is that they're working with, that this is pre-earnings information, it's highly confidential, but I will verify and go, you know what? You classified this thing as a community and it was an open community in the entire company, yet you're posting files of credit card numbers in it. That doesn't mesh. So I'm going to scan the service to make sure that basically the labels match and that I'm going to look for and do data loss prevention on top of my groups. And because I have this identification of valuable information, I'm going to protect the content. I'm going to protect assets where they need to protect it. And I'll talk a lot in more detail about this in just a moment. But in addition to the basic things of limiting reach and enforcing policy, I'm going to make sure that my employees, when they're accessing my data on my tenancy, they're coming in on trusted devices. I know you're not coming in on a device full of malware, for example, or a phone that's been compromised and it isn't up to date. I want to understand that you're safe coming in. And so I'm going to want to make sure you've got conditional access on against my tenant. I'll talk about how that works too, to a certain degree. And lastly, ensuring accountability ties right back to enabling my employees, that I can audit what my employees are doing. And I can make sure that owners reattest to the existence of guests. I absolutely want guests in my tenant because I'd rather that Windows employee work for a chip manufacturer on my tenant than emailing the content outside. So I absolutely want those guests there, but at the same time, I'm going to make sure that renewal is happening, the membership accountability is happening. And again, between groups and SharePoint, there's a ton here to make this all viable, make this scale for us. So let me go in an extra level detail. So I first of all think about that self-service enablement I mentioned earlier. Number one, I mentioned full-time employees can create a group. How do I do that? Well, I have a security group that's a dynamic Azure AD group, which is automatically built up of everyone, every employee in the tenancy, that where their account is set to say, hey, your employment status is full-time employee. If you're in that group, you're automatic. If your account is set that way, you're automatically in that group, and therefore that group is the only set of people who are allowed to create Microsoft group 365 groups, Microsoft just groups. So you'll be able to create a group, but if you're a supplier, you won't be in that list. Therefore, no group creation. And so for me, this becomes an automatic and easy thing for me to manage. I simply have a dynamic group set up, therefore anyone can do it. But by the way, a key aspect of this is I use the in-product UI. I don't use a custom form. I don't drive people to some submission process and make you fill out some IT process to go through and get something. Because here's the deal. I want my employees to work where they're naturally working. You're in Microsoft Teams and you want to create a new project, you want to create a new team, great, do it right there. Don't go out and have to think about it really hard and potentially just say, you know what, forget it, I'm just going to send this via email. No, I want you to keep it in place, go create a new group. By the way, I collect label for that group. I want to understand what kind of group that is. So I talk about what that is, how that works. Secondly, like same thing's true in SharePoint, that I want to understand what kind of site this is. And so I collect all that at creation time. So I can let my employees create in the workload they're in, whether it's a Yammer community or an Outlook group, SharePoint or Teams, doesn't matter. Like go create the thing in the experience it's in. And I'm going to govern and protect and manage. But that said, I'm not going to let you keep it forever. I'm going to have a lifecycle management. And I've gradually tuned up this lifecycle to say now every 180 days your group is going to be renewed. There's a blade in Azure AD that lets me define that I can say, hey, all my groups must go through a lifecycle management. Every group must be managed. Therefore, I have that in place to require that every employee who owns a group is going to get notified that their group is going to require a renewal effectively. Now, that said, The group's expiration framework in Azure AD has an auto renew baked in. If you have a SharePoint site with activity behind your group, or a team has channel conversations in that group, those are all great scenarios. Or Outlook email, for example. Those are all things that basically tell me, hey, you know what, this group is active. You should care about it. You should keep it. Don't delete it. So therefore, it auto renews. So I configure those policies. And if an employee isn't an active group, if a group is quiet, for example, maybe it's stale, maybe it was no longer needed, the owner of a group will get notification. They'll get notification in Teams. They'll get notification in Outlook as an owner. And the whole beauty here is they'll be able to renew a group right in place. I can click the button and renew that group. I can also understand what this group is for. Hey, this group is connected to this SharePoint site. This group is connected to this team. Therefore, I can understand what this thing is about. That way it takes the guesswork out of, why do I even have this thing? Why does it exist? I understand that. And I get 3 warnings. I get a 30-day warning, a 15-day warning, and a 1-day warning. If I still take no action and the group therefore gets deleted, I get a final mail as group owner that says, hey, your group has been deleted. Do you want to bring it back to life? And you have 30 final days to bring your group back to life. And so for us as an IT organization, what this allows me to do is say, how I've got that sprawl prevention in place. The groups are only here as long as they're actively needed and used. And I have a self-service enablement to say that owner is able to renew and even restore during the time windows available to them without even having to engage IT. I don't want to have a lot of IT overhead on all this. I've got massive numbers of groups. I can't take help desk tickets for everybody who's got a group renewal. So I want to make sure this is as simple as possible. And this is all in product. So everything I'm talking about to you so far, product does directly in Azure AD. I can manage this against my Microsoft 365 group. So I mentioned earlier the external collaboration story, that I really want that Xbox organization to work with a game studio on my tenant. I don't want those files leaving the tenant boundary and being passed around, and I no longer have visibility on who has access and who's opening the file or anything else. So I want to make sure that those projects are done directly in place and in Teams. Therefore, we allow the guest member to be directly invited into team. Great. Now that guest can get brought in. But by the way, just because I may default allowing guests doesn't mean you're always allowed. I mentioned earlier I might have some really secret project or financial pre-earnings information or an acquisition. Great, no guests allowed here. This is completely locked off, and groups allows me to do that lock off, and I'll talk about how I do that. But the beautiful thing is that the employee is able to control those guests and the membership of their group, and assuming that guest is allowed in because the properties of a group allow it, therefore that guest has access to a SharePoint, the team behind the group and everything else, meaning they're a full participant of it. I no longer need to have that guest simply engage with a Microsoft employee via other tools or email or anything else that potentially is a detriment to collaboration. They can work in place and co-author documents just like any other member of a team, and that makes it really, it speeds up engagement, it speeds up a partnership, and it makes that guest a full-fledged partner in the project, which is rather critical. But at the same time, I may also not want that guest to be a full member of a group. I may want them just to have access to a file. And again, I can say, based on properties of the SharePoint connected to the group, I can determine that this location is going to be open, so guests are allowed to have a file shared to them or not. So let's say that my Windows partners want to share a file of a standards body. Great. As long as the location they're sharing it from is open to guests, they can share it. But again, I do trust but verify. So just because you put that file into a group that's wide open, for example, or open enough to guests, doesn't mean I'm not going to scan it. I look at that file and go, hey, this file had sensitive information in it. I'm going to block it from being shared externally. So again, with the group's construct, allowing my employees to work in place where it makes sense and block where I need to block. And so how do I do all that? How do I understand what kind of content exists? Well, I have a labeling schema effectively, and I've had this for many years, although we changed our wording for what these things mean. But effectively, every file, every SharePoint site, every team can be classified. In fact, in a group's perspective, every team, every SharePoint, every Yammer group, every Outlook group, they must be classified, they must be labeled. And so in our case, highly confidential team or SharePoint, that's the deep secrets. That's the customer data. That's the project that's really secret that we do not want guests in this place. It's going to be protected no matter what. Whereas confidential for us, that's secret. We want to make sure it's protected. It's not meant to be all company even. It's definitely not meant to leave a company unless, of course, there's a partner who's under some sort of non-disclosure agreement, in which case, maybe that Windows and chip manufacturer can work together in that space. But I want to understand what that thing is. So again, I label to make sure that I can understand, is this highly confidential, or general, so that therefore I understand and can manage and apply appropriate policies to these things. Now, these labels also apply to files. I'm not going to go into file classification, but I'll just mention that for the sake of completeness here, that label of highly confidential, I'd be able to go in and put a label on that file and say confidential Microsoft full-time only, in which case it applies protection to that file. But the nice part of this is I use those same classifications of a container itself, of a SharePoint and team. And up until now, I've been doing this with Azure AD classifications. That in the Azure AD, I can define what is that set of words, that set of terms, set of classifications that define what the groups are allowed to be collected as. And that's what I've been doing. And Azure AD supports all this, and it's been great. Group workloads, whether it's SharePoint or Teams or Yammer, they all support that collection. So when an employee goes into a SharePoint site, they're asked, what is this? Oh, that's good. And it's a nice story. But up until now, it hasn't been connected. And up until now, I've been in the state where I'd say, yeah, you just created a confidential SharePoint site, for example, or a confidential team, a confidential group, and I selected public. Well, that doesn't make sense. I don't want a public group. So I have custom tooling up until now, what runs against my group to make sure that I flip the switches and make it apply correctly. But that's what's changing. Is especially now that sensitivity labels have gone general availability, I'm now in the state of moving to use sensitivity labels to manage this. And that becomes a connection point between the file labels that I just mentioned and the container labels that were used to be in Azure AD. Now I've got one place I can define both, and I've got one place I can apply policies to both. And the nice thing about this is in Azure, in the Compliance and Security Center, I can go in and say this label, highly confidential, means that this group must be private. You can't be public. It won't even let you make the switch. In fact, if you go into Microsoft Teams, for example, or SharePoint, try to create a new group, it won't even give you the option. As soon as you select confidential, you're immediately going to be locked into private, no public group whatsoever, which makes it really nice for the proactive compliance. It means that now an employee isn't going to get themselves in trouble. Right off the bat, it's going to be protected. And that's good. That means at least I get parity for what I've had today of a group must be private if it's confidential. A group may not allow guests as members if it's highly confidential. And so as you can see on the screen, I prevent that. But also continuing one step further, that SharePoint site, I can also set additional settings to say, hey, based on the fact that the SharePoint site behind the group is highly confidential, no guest sharing at all. So not only no guest members, but just plain old no guest sharing. And I can set what level of sharing is allowed on the group in addition, and therefore site, as long as the label is set. And so again, this gets really cool because it drives up proactive compliance. Employees can't even start to get into a bad state because the labels protect them. You select the label, you're good to go. And there's a couple other sessions that are interesting about this topic. One of them is a SharePoint OneDrive session around what's new in security and compliance in SharePoint OneDrive. Worth checking out. There's a lot more detail and some demos that they're going to go over. How does this work? How do you configure this? And what are the other capabilities from a security compliance perspective? And I mentioned this since every group has a SharePoint. Therefore, SharePoint compliance tends to become a tenant admin's thinking. You want to be concerned. You think about that team, that group has a SharePoint. Therefore, I want to manage a SharePoint. So again, there's a lot of stuff to check out there. Plus, there's an additional demo and explanation in our governance and management best practices for Microsoft 365 groups. So another session to potentially check out and watch more about how this works and more details about ways of configuring this stuff. But so far, this is what I'm configuring for myself, for my tenant. I use label highly confidential. I therefore block guests from it. I therefore make it private. And so in my case, I had to kind of do this merger of labels at the container level and labels at the item level. And I had these same parent labels, general, confidential, and highly confidential, as I mentioned earlier. But now that I'm doing this merger, I think through what can be selected by someone? When is something just a container label? In other words, it can just be used at a group or a SharePoint site versus what is an item label and therefore can be used in PowerPoint or Word or an email to protect the content at the file level or email level. Great, I now have a deeper definition. Here's a subset of those labels that I use. An example, a file perspective, I'll use Microsoft full-time employee as an example. You can say if it's an item level and it's going to provide protection against the file. But at the same time, I'll have confidential Microsoft extended and external as a container label, meaning that when someone goes to create a new SharePoint site or a new group, that label will automatically make it so that that group is going to be allow guests. They're not going to be there by default. It's of course going to be locked by default, and the owner, I should say, can bring the guests in, but it's going to be private. It's not going to be open. Whereas highly confidential in my world, of course, I generally don't want guests. In my highly confidential Microsoft Extended is a container label. It's also an item label, and it means in my case, no guests, must be private. But let's say, for example, that someone comes to me and says, I'm working on this highly confidential project with this other company, and it's really secret on both our company's parts. I won't name names because, of course, we've got lots of partners that we work with. But point is, I have that sometimes some people come to us and say they've got this exception project effectively, and it is highly confidential. It needs to leave a company boundary. Great, we will evaluate that. And again, through the power of labels, I'll be able to say, hey, this is Microsoft Extended and External highly confidential, but the employee themselves can't add that label. It's only scoped so IT can add the label, which means that if someone does come into us and says, hey, the rules you have in place, it says highly confidential, no guests, that doesn't work. I need guests. But at the same time, my content is highly confidential, not confidential. Therefore, I need to work with you. So can you please help me? So we have this exception label in place. And that's the nice thing about this. Labels for us give us this ability to say, define the policies of a group and to prevent the employee from making mistakes in the get-go. And at the same time, having enough IT control that if we need to have exceptions and scoped labels to manage them, we can. So I talked a lot about how the products work, and which is great because there's a ton of things the products do for me, and I use as much as possible. But like other large enterprises, I've got my own custom business rules, and I've got to be able to manage those. And so I have custom solutions that we build on top of groups. And this gets really important because everything I'm doing is all API addressable by graph, for example. And so the nice part about this is everything I'm doing, you could do too. It's just not in product directly. Here's an example. I have this Microsoft Groups policies that says, hey, every group needs 2 owners. Every group needs a full-time employee as an owner. Well, at creation time, I mandated that only full-time employees can create a group. Great. But over the life cycle of that group, maybe the full-time employee added a supplier to that group as an owner. Maybe that owner left the company completely. Now the only owner is a supplier. Well, that's not good. So I'm going to detect the fact what groups are in what state. I scan the tenant. I itemize. I understand what groups need compliance and taking action. I send communications out to those group owners that says, you need to take action. This looks an awful lot like, in many ways, the renewal mail, because in fact it was modeled off the same deal to say, take action on the group that you own. And now you're going to go in and change the ownership for your group. You're going to go into our form and you're going to tell us there's another owner for group. We're going to write that back. You're going to be good to go. Again, all using APIs against the graph. And assuming you take action, you're good to go. You're done. If you don't take action, though, we're going to delete the group and tell you we deleted it. So again, to make sure that I can hold my employees accountable, make sure that I've got the right policies in place for my groups. So in my case, every group must have 2 owners. Every group, one of those owners must be a full-time employee. So every group, by the way, also must be labeled, but I'll get to that in a few. But the nice thing about that is I can therefore apply policies to the groups that I have above and beyond what the product does. The other aspect of this that I get a lot of requests for is, well, how do you manage these large communities? I have a VP who will say, hey, I need an all hands community so that I can have conversations within my business. Oh, and by the way, I want to use a stream channel to broadcast to that community. And again, groups power all these things. I have my retail partners who will tell me, I need a group per set of retail employees, for example, formerly what you consider a store, or I want a group based on everyone with a certain attribute in the HR profile. Great. How do I go do that? Well, dynamic groups is what I will try to use as much as possible. I mentioned earlier, I use AAD dynamic groups in a ton of scenarios. For example, the Microsoft full-time employee scenario, I do use dynamic groups for that, and it works great. But now I need these organization groups. I need these groups for every VP, for example. I need to make sure I limit by full-time employees under that leader, for example. I need to create groups by profession or part of a company. And so one of the things we built is we built another custom solution that simply takes a rule book effectively of what does this group consist of? Everybody under this leader, every group of everybody with these properties, for example. Great. It'll then go into Azure AD, get the information out, and calculate and build the group itself membership wise. And it uses HR data to help do that. It'll also take an existing security group. Because the other scenario that people talk to me a lot about is they'll say, hey, I already have a security group built out. I manage this deeply, but that security group really doesn't help me with my team, for example, or my Microsoft 365 group. So this tool will take that as a membership construct and say, I'm going to use a security group to drive group membership for my team, for example. And so either way, whether it's a security group or various attributes, we'll go in, we'll compute the membership, and we'll then write it back out to Azure AD. So one of the other things that I do simply to make groups even better, so that way Yammer becomes really effective at scale, for example. That way leaders can have the teams that they need, the group, the SharePoint sites they need. The membership is managed in cases where it's a large membership, complex membership, and needs to be built appropriately. So I do all these things with groups. Now, one of the nice things about this is I'll lead with, there's another session that has even more details about what I'm talking about here, which is there's an admin session on how admins can become more efficient and implement Microsoft 365 groups. And it's going to talk about my tool, my group membership management tool. We're working now to make it available to customers in various ways. Now, keeping in mind, it's an IT tool. I built it to fill a gap in product. And so we built tool, we're working to share that tool with you as much as possible, or at least share examples of how we do it so that you can emulate where it makes sense. So it's all built on Graph APIs, as I mentioned earlier. Set up your Azure subscription, run against this tool, manage the memberships of groups that you need, for example. And again, set your frequency as you need to, because in our case, I have such a large AD, I don't calculate every minute. I recalculate, for example, every few hours. And so that way membership management is accurate. It's just not necessarily immediate. But I can have this tool available, and we're working to share this as best we can, while in parallel understanding that in the future, the Microsoft Groups roadmap is providing additional tooling and capability to bring a lot of these scenarios directly into various products. And so this becomes a stepping stone to how to do group membership management in the meantime. This is what I do. This is what you can emulate, but in the future, there'll be better ways to do it too. So just in summary, a few key things I wanted to talk through and a couple other policies I'll mention. Here's a quick summary of the policies that I apply and where I use in product to do it versus not. And a ton of the things I do, I mentioned earlier in this conversation, are done in product. Like, for example, the expiration, the external membership management, the whether a guest is allowed or not, for example, whether a group must be public or private, all things based on label. I do things like for multi-geo to say, hey, this group, the employee creating this group is a European employee. Oh, great. Go create the assets for that group in SharePoint and email in Europe. Don't go provision them in a different region because those assets should remain in Europe. And so the group will provision in the right place. The lifecycle management I mentioned earlier. But other big things that people ask me a lot about, the naming rules. I don't do naming rules internally from the divisional perspective. And the reason I don't do that is I don't want an employee going through a list of teams to see the same starting few letters, for example, for every team. I don't want to add confusion or impairment on that. Everything shouldn't say Xbox _, for example, just because you're an Xbox, because that way it makes them all blend together and it makes it harder for me to see all the things I have. So I purposely don't prefix everything, even though naming rules could. But I do use naming rules to enforce the naughty word list effectively. What words does IT want to block? I don't want you to create a group called admin, for example. So clearly, I'm going to make sure that there's some things that are simply going to get blocked on group creation time. So those are all things I do. Again, enabling self-service at group creation, making sure my employees understand what's what, making sure, by the way, that label is not just collected, but displayed. Because here's the other part of this. I mentioned earlier, I want to identify highly confidential information. And this is not just because of the notion that I'm going to have tools that are going to protect that information. It's also a cultural aspect. That if I'm in a team and I know that I'm working with sensitive data, I'm probably not going to talk about it too loudly outside of a team. I shouldn't be talking about it in the hallways or outside the buildings, for example. I'm going to be careful. And so part of this is user education and user awareness. I want my employees to classify for a tooling, and I want those groups, and I want people to classify so people are aware of how to handle the information that they're working with. And again, all of these things are things that I'm doing with the products themselves between Azure AD and Microsoft 365 to manage my Microsoft 365 groups. On top of that, though, I mentioned earlier a lot of the customizations I put on top. I mentioned the ownership accountability policy that I manage. I mentioned that I do policies for my groups overall. I do also, by the way, do reach-based policies in SharePoint, for example, behind that group to make sure that I can protect myself a little bit even more. I do membership management, especially for those scenarios I mentioned earlier. But I also have all engineering, for example, in my company. Well, that's got to be a group too. Make sure that's managed. Nice Yammer community for that, for example. Nice group that can be used to manage your SharePoint sites and secure your stuff and span and help you span a bunch of different communities that exist. So making sure that I build these solutions that do membership management too. So all things that I manage to enable groups, but also protect the company. So there's an awful lot of content available throughout Microsoft's IT showcase, effectively, of how Microsoft does it. Because here's the deal, that we are a customer ourselves, and we're going to basically put ourselves through a little more pain than hopefully we put you through as a customer. And we learn often what works, what doesn't work, how we configure things, and hopefully some of that sharing can go to you and leverage and kind of learn from what we've done to make you successful, just like we've been successful. So we have a lot of content about that as well on IT Showcase. Plus, there's an awful lot of content from other sessions related to this topic. And just to call out a couple big ones, there's a roadmap topic on Microsoft Groups and what's coming. And that's going to be a really interesting session, for example. A lot more on tips and tricks on how to manage groups and be efficient from an IT management perspective. And of course, basically the roadmap itself. So definitely all kinds of things to check out and learn. And hopefully this session was useful and valuable. Well, I hope this was useful for you all today, and I hope you benefit from Microsoft 365 groups overall. And my kind of departing statement is enable self-service where you can, because the fundamental principle here of letting your employees work where they are in the context where they are becomes so critical for successful collaboration. It prevents that model where employees are working outside the company boundary. It prevents the model that I don't really know what's going on, they're working in place. But it does mean some IT compromise to say, I'm letting my employee create Microsoft 365 groups in the workload they're in and let them be successful. So I hope this was useful. I hope you saw how I make that happen, how I manage groups within Microsoft itself. And I hope that if there's more information you're looking for from Microsoft's IT organization and how we run it, you check out resources I mentioned earlier. Thank you.